wherever you are, to a special edition of Polaris Book Reviews. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Charles William Daly. The date is July the 18th, 2026, and it is my pleasure to interview fellow traditionalist and Polaris for Dissidents podcast creator, Dr. Alexander Wolfheze. We will be talking specifically today about Dr. Wolfheze's 2024 book, Globus Horribilis, 12 Futuro-Fundamentalist Essays. Globus Horribilis was published in London in 2024 by Arctos Media Limited. Globus Horribilis, a Latin expression, means in English horrible world or horrible globe. Near the end of Dr. Wolfheze's book on page 487, he quotes from scholar Bjard Bennett's January 2011 article, which is entitled Globus Horribilis, the Role of the Bolos in Manichaean Eschatology and its Polemical Transformation, in Augustine's anti-Manichaean writings. Quote, one of the basic features of Manichaean eschatology was a belief that all evil would eventually be imprisoned within a globular mass, and that the souls of those who had refused to accept the religion of light would be affixed to this globular mass forever. This, assumedly, is the inspiration for the title of Dr. Wolfheze's book that we shall discuss today. Globus Horribilis is the third book in a trilogy of books written by Dr. Wolfheze, which I've heard him refer to as his Latin trilogy, all of the titles being in Latin. Volume 1, published in 2019, is entitled Alba Rosa, 10 Traditionalist Essays about the Crisis in the Modern West. Volume 2, published in 2021, is entitled Rupus Nigra, an Archaeofuturist Countdown in 12 Essays. Dr. Wolfheze is also the author of the 3-volume A Traditionalist History of the Great War. Volume 1 is entitled The Sunset of Tradition and the Origin of the Great War. Volume 2 is entitled The Former Earth. And Volume 3 is entitled Into the Abyss. Dr. Wolfheze, in addition, is the author of a great many essays and articles published by multiple outlets, including Arctos Media Limited, which also published several of my essays in one of my books, Serpent Symbol and Tradition. So, Dr. Wolfheze, thank you for joining us today and sharing your thoughts on your most recent work. How are you doing this fine day?
Well, thank you, Charles, for the kind introduction, and for it's a pleasure to speak to a fellow traditionalist, as always, and also for reading the book, because, of course, that takes quite an effort. Not everybody is willing to put effort in reading books these days. The only slight amendment I can make here to the description of the book that you will make, perhaps that maybe should be set up front, is that there are collections. Each of these 3 books are collections of essays. So people are able to read essay by essay without necessarily having to read the whole book. That's just one slight thing I want to say up front if people are discouraged by a 600-page volume.
Yes, and my approach today is that I shall first read a number of passages from Globus Horribilis that summarize some of the book's major points, allowing you, Alexander, to explain or expound a bit on each of these. Then I shall turn to a number of quotations that I have more specific questions on. Some of these quotations are quite long, but also quite rewarding and very much worth pondering deeply. The viewer or listener should know that many of the passages I will read are from a number of authors that Dr. Wolfheze quotes at length in his book, as well as many of his own original ideas, which will be indicated by either Dr. Wolfheze or myself. I have organized questions according to several themes that I will indicate as we discuss each of these themes. Let us first consider, however, the synopsis of Globus Horribilis that is provided on Amazon.com. Quote, Globus Horribilis views the world-changing events of 2020 to 2021 from the shock and awe of the initial pandemic, across the BLM and Biden crises, to the final vaccine solution, as a single process, named after its outcome, the fall of the West. Through a Futuro-Fundamentalist approach, which combines horizon bridging, Archaeofuturist Prometheus, and eternity-grounded, traditionalist, Eurasianist, analytical perspectives, the writer aims at a holistic understanding of the origins, triggers, and vectors of the epoch-ending event sequence of 2020 to 2021. The 4 parts and 8 chapters of Globus Horribilis may be read independently, but in synthetic combination, They point the reader to that most elusive element within observed and lived history, meaning. The first part combines eyewitness style running commentaries on the events of the 10 months that shook the world with reset retrospectives that expose their hidden psychohistorical implications. The second part focuses on the now darkened West and sketches some largely overlooked but vitally important inner and outer aspects of its fall. The third part looks to the East, where authentically preserved knowledge, authentically rooted life, and authentically experienced transcendence offer light sources to chase away the dark shadows that have covered the West. Finally, the fourth part of Globus Horribilis offers a doubly scientific and eschatological default prognosis, a forward projection of the devolutionary trajectory of Western-led postmodernity that eerily aligns with the precognized cinder-earth version, or vision rather, of ancient scripture. So, Alexander, you refer many times in Globus Horribilis to the concepts of New World Order, dissident right, globalist cabal, and Eurasianism. I think that many listeners and viewers will have a general notion of what you mean by these terms, or at least most of them. But let us be a bit more explicit. Let's begin with the first two terms, New World Order and dissident right, and later get to the last two, globalist cabal and Eurasianism. So on page 4, for example, you state, quote, the author, yourself, posits that under the New World Order dispensation, there is now no more space for Western civilization or Western man in any meaningful sense of the word. The West has fallen. This also means that the former dissident right, hitherto the most formidable champion of Western civilization and Western man, has effectively lost its raison d'etre, except in its archival or nostalgic aspects. Close quote. So my question here, Alexander, assuming that not all listeners are political animals to the same degree as you and I are, is what do you mean by New World Order, and how briefly do you define dissident right?
Well, dissident right, in its best form, I think, used to be represented by the publisher of our first books, yours and mine, Arctos Media. It used to be a publisher that collected works from the past and from the present and put them in a straitjacket called the dissident right straitjacket. But very important to realize for people is that the dissident right is in fact nothing else but a collection of people that were true dissidents from the system that's being imposed. I call that the New World Order system. And these dissidents are, of course, of various shades and hues. I mean, there are people that are Christian, there are people who are Muslim, there are people who are atheists who are part of this movement. There are people who are interested in science, who merely like to expose all kinds of frauds perpetuated on the Western peoples. There are people that are concerned about culture and about immigration. But in the larger sense, the dissident right is also a philosophical movement. It has been trying to create, I would say, new perspectives on a series of problems that the West is coping with, which are, in my view, existential. And one of these futurist approaches is that of GameFi. People know the term archaeofuturism. But of course, that does not mean that traditionalism, which is my perspective, does not also offer a futurist approach. That sounds a little bit contradictory, but I believe that there is such a thing as a traditionalist way for many problems to be addressed that the Western peoples are facing. And a future perspective, this is why I called my book Futuro Fundamentalist, a future perspective, in my view, is essential for any traditionalist. So let's say that the oldest form of traditionalist philosophy, in a historical sense, look back. So people tend to look forward, and the past is in their back, and they are trying to view and look ahead. But a traditionalist does the opposite. He is turned to the past, sees tradition as the resource, the source, and the inspiration of all he does. He looks back and he is pulled into the future. Now, what we see along the way of the path from the past to the present, in my view, gives a trajectory. It is by this we are able to establish a trajectory toward what we are going to, namely the future. So I think traditionalism is a much better way of approaching questions about how the future will look like than many others. In any case, dissident right in this sense, in the best sense of the word, is also a philosophical project. And that's what I've been trying to live up to in a quite modest way. In any case, from a cultural historical perspective and a cultural anthropological perspective, I've done my best.
Thank you for that answer. I think that clears up quite a bit. Um, on page 17 of your book, you state that in the West, the forces of modernist subversion conspire to promote all forms of religious and spiritual interest, except those that are authentic, especially the authentic form of Christianity. Hence the pervasive marketing of spiritual fads and fashions of all sorts, especially those that are exotic, pseudo-oriental, obscure, pseudo-ancient, and occult, pseudo-magic. With regard to authentic traditions, neo-spiritualism aims at the dilution and deflection of their inherent spiritual potentiality by introducing distortions, adulterations, and innovations. Appealing to all that is sub-intellectual, sensational, promiscuous, morbid, and traumatic, neo-spiritualism works through a legion of false prophets, astrologers, faith healers, mediums, seers, mystics, spiritists, anthroposophists, and theosophists. Its effect on Western civilization has been to push and reinforce a downward drift towards, quote, feminized spirituality, psychopathic compensation, hedonist escapism, existentialist alienation, and inverted transcendence, close quote. So I have a couple of questions in relation to this passage, Alexander. What do you mean here by a feminized spirituality? And what do you mean by psychopathic compensation? Also, can you name a few of today's prominent false prophets that you are thinking of in this passage?
Well, of course, it is true that these terms are, in a certain sense, subjective. They describe the traditionalist perspective on so-called spirituality today. One thing is for sure is that many traditional religious functions can only be fulfilled by men. So many functions in the church, the Catholic Church and Orthodox Church, can only be fulfilled by a man. Certain positions can only be filled by a man. There are all kinds of reasons for that, not only a historical growth, they have also to do with the aim of the tradition. Now, a labor division between male and female, of course, is something that is characteristic of all true tradition. Labor division also within the genders. So the birthright that you are born with, the vocation that you are born with, also decides a lot. In any case, to allow females to fulfill certain ritual functions will result in spiritual deformation. So that does not mean that the female does not have a spiritual life. It does also not mean that she cannot fulfill certain spiritual functions. It just means that from a traditionalist perspective, male and female functions are quite distinct. So I think that's how I would answer the first part of the question. Please repeat the second and third separately.
Sure. The second question is, what do you mean by psychopathic compensation? And then I was just wondering if you could name a few of today's false prophets that you're alluding to. Just one or two would be fine.
Yeah. So, of course, Evola already pointed to the beginning of the degeneration process in the West. Let's take that as an example. There are also other cultures which suffer from deformation, Islam not being the least. But in the Christian tradition, as Evola stated, the betrayal of the clergy is key. So the fish starts to rot from the head. The clergy being the highest functional group within European tradition, namely the group that provides ideally access to the transcendental sphere for ordinary people as well. This group has betrayed, from a traditionalist perspective, its task, and by doing so also betrayed the people that it's supposed to serve. So it is inevitable that all kinds of grotesque deformations take place and inversions. So an inversion in this sense would be, for example, what we are seeing today, and that's called Zionist Christianity or Judeo Christianity. There are people that seriously believe that such a thing is possible, that such constructs are conceivable, and they're living up to this illusion because this has, of course, political implications. It has cultural implications that are going very, very far. In your own country, the United States, of course, you will know how to recognize people adhering to Zio Christianity or Judeo Christian thought patterns. And this is just a simple example. It means that two opposite terms are being combined and are being presented as a viable, authentically rooted tradition, which they are not, which they cannot be. That is not to pick on either part of the equation, neither on the Zionist part nor on the Judeo part. Um, Judaism is an authentic tradition as well from a traditionalist perspective, but it's just the fact that they cannot be, the traditions have to be respected on their own terms and cannot be mixed up. They cannot be used to create something new. They cannot be created, they cannot be used to justify a political project or any worldly project for that matter. So, of course, there are all kinds of people that you could associate with this. I think that prominent examples now are actually not many because there are not many people that claim to be religious leaders in a true sense of the word. Of course, we could consider that the Roman Catholic Church has most literally betrayed its origins. So I would call the Pope would probably be you could classify him as authentic false prophet in the sense of tradition. For Protestant religions, that's a little bit different because Protestantism has always emphasized different dogmas and different parts of scripture and different theological approaches. But I think that the example of the Catholic Church should suffice.
All right. And just as a follow-up to that question, so this attempt to combine traditions that are not entirely consistent, would that be an example of psychopathic compensation?
Yes, it's in fact a deformation of the spiritual body which the church is supposed to be. But there are other examples of such. In Islam, the same happens with Takfiri groups. So, for example, there is such a thing as a Wahhabism, which in the 19th century was kind of a purist form of Islam. But it has become psychopathic, a term which we can use quietly here. It is undoubtedly true that in its modern manifestations, this Takfiri so-called religious grouping has inverted the values of Islam, the theology of Islam, and also the practices of Islam. To the extent of creating an antithesis to Islam itself. And the perversions, of course, they are well known to everybody. Head choppers, people that burn others alive, that reopen slave markets, and that regress into atavistic behavioral forms. So the psychopathy is clear in this case. And I think, as always, here the saying applies. By the fruits you shall know the tree, including the diseased fruits, showing the diseased tree.
Thank you. On page 21 of your book, you begin to talk about the so-called indigo children. I am of Generation X, one of the later births in the later period of Generation X. So this is of great interest to me. I naturally perhaps believe that Gen Xers are rather different from other generations. So on page 21, you state the indigo children perception is particular to what sociologists term Generation X, i.e., the demographic cohort of Westerners conventionally defined as born between the baby boomers and the millennials, i.e., between approximately 1965 and 1990. To properly study the indigo thesis, it is necessary to briefly consider the very specific cultural and psychohistorical input received by Generation X. This input provides the necessary background to the three main theses of Globus Horribilis. And then on page 24, you also state, as the baby boomers started putting their radical 1960s counterculture theories of self-realization and sexual revolution into practice, Generation X faced its very own hellstorm, a perfect storm of societal disruption. Biologically, it faced unprecedented rates of divorce, single parenthood, domestic violence, sexual abuse, drug addiction, prostitution, and suicide. Culturally, it faced the deliberate and relentless dumbing down of education, media, and art. Ecologically, it witnessed the fatal degradation of the human and natural environment as overpopulation, industrial pollution, and climate change started to spin out of control. Perceptually, it was subjected to the first devastating wave of transhumanism, as automation, digitalization, and virtualization destroyed the fabric of reality itself. And then one more quote on this subject on page 25. You state, yet despite the steep downward trajectory on which Western civilization has been since its 1970s apex point, and despite the tremendous havoc wrought by the boomer generation since then, in some sense, Generation X may still be said to have access to an as yet unopened, quote, window of opportunity. This is the ultimate implication of the indigo thesis, that somewhere within Generation X, the highest psycho-evolutionary point of Western civilization has been reached, close quote. So my question here, Alexander, is that I would like for you to explain to some degree what you mean by saying that there is a Gen Xer out there somewhere, or more than one, that has attained, as you say, quote, the highest psycho-evolutionary point of Western civilization. I have read that the average IQ score of Americans topped out in the year 1975 and declined afterwards. I'm assuming that is an integral point to your answer to this question, but what would you say in response to that?
Well, you got right to the point with the indigo thesis. This is a very important part to understanding my book. The indigo thesis, the term, is not made by X generation people. So it has been the term comes from baby boomers describing their children or some of the later people born. Um, and it was done. This term comes from an observation of what we call in New Age jargon auras or halu colors, right? So now we are getting into real wild territory, of course, for people in the dissident right, because New Age is not a very popular phenomenon, rightly so. But in any case, the observation was made that some people within I would call it the last real Western generation ever born, the X generation, started to show signs of a unique spiritual coloring. So I just used this term for fun because I thought it was worth thinking about. But I'm approaching it from a non-New Age perspective, namely the traditionalist perspective. And it stands to reason that when a civilization reaches its apex point, which in terms of worldly power and in terms of its prestige, it certainly reached around 1980. It stands to reason that there is a certain amount of overshoot once it starts to decline. Overshoot meaning that there are people of very high quality that still experience the decline. for many reasons, you could say that the baby boomers are the last generation of the West in the sense that they were the last ones that were brought up in the old paradigm. I'm talking about the epistemological paradigm, cultural and religious paradigm. But as far as biological descent, the X generation is that. So the X generation would be the last one. And there is a very big question mark here. So if it's true that there is an overshoot in terms of ability, that can be intellectual ability, it can also be in perception ability, it can also be in synthesizing ability, artistic ability. If that is true, then what is the goal of this generation? Because it's facing declining culture from the moment it's born, in fact. 1980, by the way, I call it the ABBA point, ABBA, of course, called after the Swedish pop group, but of course also A to B means rise and B to A means decline. So that would be 1980, 1979. Christopher Lush, he says 79. I think somewhere around that time you said 75 was the high point of American IQ. That might very well be true. So we are talking about approximately the same time. And I think the abilities that are hidden in the X generation, for that very reason, must be mathematically astounding. There must be some people able to do things that others have not been able to do thus far. You can compare it a little bit with a natural process. So a tree grows, there's a root, then there is a branch, but then there is a stem, then there is a branch, then there is a twig, then there is a leaf, and finally, there is a blossom. And of course, it's written it's written in the Bible, um, of the seed must die before it gives life to a new life. A new life springs from it. So of course, that's true for the flower. The flower is just the end result that serves to attract the forces for recreation and regeneration. So somewhere in our generation, there must be flower products, I would call it, end products. That's how I would answer that.
Okay, thank you. On pages 27 to 28, you provide a more exact summary of Globus Horribilis than what is provided on Amazon.com. I'd just like to go back to that to fix this in the minds of the viewers and listeners. On page 27, you state, although each part and each chapter of Globus Horribilis can be read and understood as a standalone narrative and essay, these separate components are constructed around and aligned with three linking theses. One, the fall of the West thesis, that is, what traditionalism describes as the crisis of the modern world is currently reaching its critical end phase. On page 28, two, the default outcome thesis. With the fall of the West, the degenerative processes of the Dark Age have reached a critical downward threshold. They are now beyond the reach of any political holding action and any political corrective intervention. At this point, the bleakest Globus Horribilis outcome is locked in, that is, globalist nihilist victory. And three, the Indigo Children thesis, which you just talked about, the still hidden kill switch for modernity, which is also the reset button of the cosmological cycle, has been armed since modernity reached its apex point in the West. It now only needs to be pushed. It may correspond to an as yet unmanifested, quote, source code access within the Indigo Children segment of Generation X, which was born at the evolutionary apex point. So again, on this matter of the Indigo Children and their role to play in what seems to be the possible salvation of Western civilization, can you go further into this idea that Generation X is a kill switch that may be used to undo or overcome the dark forces of modern subversion?
Well, it is just a thesis, right? It's a thesis that it is possible that such a thing would happen. There's no traditionalist thesis that corresponds to a predictive model. Free will is also an element that comes into play here. It could be that there is a switch, but that nobody wants to turn it. it could be that there is a key, but there is nobody that wants to insert it into a law. Let's compare it to the Old Testament story. The Old Testament builds up to a certain crucial moment, which Christians call the appearance of Christ. So, in fact, Christ was the fulfillment of the entire law that preceded him, and also the culmination point of the history of the Bani Israel, the people of Israel. And he was, let's say, in their tradition, the kill switch. He was the culminating point, right? I mean, that's how the Christian theologians look at the matter. And it's a good comparison because there are two aspects here. First is the active and the passive, and then there is the passive aspect. The active aspect is this, that Christ was also truly man, according to Christian theology. Not only God, but he was also truly man. And this means he possessed free will and he could choose. He could choose his destiny, he could choose his vocation. He could also refuse it. He didn't, but he could. And the same, then there is the passive point. The passive side of the equation is the acceptance of the mechanism put into force by the kill switch. So, of course, Jesus might have fulfilled his mission, but it doesn't mean that everybody within the tradition that he came from accepted his function, which is clearly true, because clearly there are people who haven't accepted Jesus as a Messiah in the Judaic tradition. The Judaic tradition, which claims to, of course, stand for the Bani Israel, the children of Israel. So I'm using this as an analogy. The same could be true for Western civilization. It could be that there is a kill switch person, perhaps even personified. It could also be an incarnated principle. It could be something akin to a Messiah, but recognizable in a human form. Because everything on this earth has a tangible and an intangible form. So it stands to reason there would be a tangible form representing the kill switch. But that also doesn't mean that person or principle involved would activate him or herself, or that it would be accepted by the Western people on whose behalf this kill switch is to be turned. Now, I'm talking in a very abstract way, because for Christians, the answer is very simple. The kill switch is the return of Christ. But of course, I'm talking from a traditionalist point of view, a general traditionalist point of view. So the traditionalist point of view has a more generic approach. It does not necessarily belong to one tradition. So I'm talking here from a wider perspective. But for Christians, the answer is very simple, simply the return of Christ. That's how I would answer that.
And that makes me think of the famous movie, The Last Temptation of Christ, in which Jesus is depicted as struggling over his possible role. And he knows that he has the potential to realize, but he doesn't really know if he should or wants to do that. So I guess just as a brief follow up to the previous question, could there be a Gen Xer out there who already knows that he or she has the potential for this great fate and is struggling with whether to try to realize it or not?
Well, ironically, I think a good answer is found in the Judaic, even rabbinical tradition. The rabbinical tradition says that the Savior of Israel is present in every generation. But it is a question of free will whether this Savior will appear and will be accepted. So it's not a question of a unique person. It is rather a question of principle being incarnated or not. But of course, there must be a worthy vessel. So the vessel to incarnate the principle must be worthy, must be cleansed or be ritually pure, as for example Jesus is in Christian theology. He is without sin. That is why he was a worthy vessel. And of course, for Generation X, looking from the Western perspective, that would require a quite a spiritually almost unique a unique level of development. But again, the indigo thesis points in that direction, because if it's true that Generation X incarnates as a whole a color code that is unique, that has never been seen before, that's the indigo thesis, then of course there must be such a person, there must be, or people, there must be such an option present within our generation. Because also I belong to the X generation, and I've made some remarkable observations myself during my life concerning the differences between generations. They're quite big, I would say. In any case, that would be my answer.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I would agree with that last statement. You've just recently mentioned the idea of free will a couple of times, which brings us nicely to the next theme that I've created in organizing these questions, and that is, what is freedom? On pages 41 to 42, you state, quote, at its core, the crisis of the modern world, most acutely experienced in the West as the most modern part of the world, is a crisis of identity. It leaves the modern West liberated individual free only in a negative sense. He is left with a formal but fictitious freedom from responsibilities in the present, where his ancestors felt bound to family, community, and fatherland, and from obligations to the past, where his ancestors felt bound to heritage, culture, and tradition. So, just a brief question on that quotation: what exactly is the modern person free to do?
Okay, I will use an analogy here coming from a well-established tradition, which is the Hindu tradition, but in a very special form. Um, People know the Hare Krishnas. So the Hare Krishnas, they adhere to a special form of Hindu theology, and it conforms to traditionalist cosmological models, in the sense that the Hare Krishnas recognize that we are living in the Kali Yuga, the last age. And in that age, they suppose that the tasks and the ritual obligations of the human, but more specifically Hindus, that these tasks and obligations, they become voided in the last age, at least at the last stage of the last age. And this gives, of course, a certain kind of freedom, which is, as you quoted, negative freedom, in the sense that um, there is no ritual form, and there is no mechanism, there is no vocational mechanism, educational mechanism, ritual mechanism, um, hierarchical mechanism by which people can um, spiritually achieve the status of their ancestors. But there is a way. The freedom is, for the Hare Krishnas, it is that they can just worship by song or in prayer the highest Godhead. That's all. Of course, this is supposed to give them joy as well, but that's just coincidental. The freedom that they aspire to comes through not trying to live up to laws, regulations, rituals that earlier generations were able to fulfill, but that younger generations living in a later age of the Kali Yuga, later stage, simply cannot carry and simply are unable to fulfill. So I think I would answer it in that way. The freedom that all humans have in the last age, whether they be Hindu or otherwise, is quite considerable, in the sense that their obligations are limited. Their ritual obligations, their religious obligations, and their hierarchical obligations, they are largely voided. So that allows them a very large latitude for salvation, in the Christian sense, salvation, enlightenment in the Buddhist sense. In any case, access to the transcendental sphere. That's the aim. So that would be the freedom that also people in the West have, as everybody else in the world, according to this idea that Hare Krishna has put forward, and it conforms to traditionalist models.
All right, thank you. On page 52, you provide a quotation from the early 20th century German playwright and poet Bertolt Brecht. Quote, The people have forfeited the trust of the government. So would it not be easier for the government to dissolve the people and elect another? Close quote. This quotation seems to get to the heart of the entire globalist project, I would say. So I would ask you, Alexander, is this not exactly what is happening now in Europe? Non Europeans are being brought into Europe en masse, and at the same time, Europeans are being re educated to hate their own civilization. Both of these things are being done in order to realize what those in power believe, quote, humanity should be. Isn't this correct?
Yes, from a traditionalist perspective, the time cosmological clock, in many ways, is most advanced in the West. That is not necessarily a compliment because also the degradation process is the deepest and quickest reached in the West. That doesn't mean it doesn't reach other areas of the world. It just means that the West shows the way, which of course makes sense. It's the last part of the Earth, right? Before you cross the ocean. That's why it's called the evening country in German Abendland. In any case, so it stands to reason that certain phenomena of degeneration are furthest advanced in the European context. That also means that our would-be globalist masters are highly inconvenienced by the European peoples because their advances in every terrain, whether they are social, legal, political, whether they be spiritual, even artistic, they stand in the way of that what they want to realize on this world, which is, of course, a closed world, a world under their control, a globus horribilis, as I have called it. And it is not a surprise that the Western peoples, they feel the full brunt of the globalist project in the most acute way. By the way, this, of course, I use this quotation from Brecht appropriately for the first part of the book. So the first chapters of the book, part one, the first three chapters are dedicated to the Great Reset, which of course started up with a pandemic, and which continued with war, and which is already showing the signs of the third horseman of the apocalypse, namely hunger. So this program, of course, is not just a replacement program. It's also a genocidal program. Uh, and in this sense, of course, both can be complementary because people's replacement can also have a genocidal aspect to it. But yes, that's how I would interpret that.
Yeah, it reminded me of. I'm sure you're aware of the famous podcaster or talk show host Alex Jones, who's also from Texas, and he often stated that the reason that the West was under attack by the globalists is because Westerners pose the greatest threat, and they are addressing the biggest problem first before handling the rest of the world population. This is a refrain of his for several years now. I don't know when he first came up with this realization.
Well, I think that's actually a quite.
But let me move to.
I
Oh,
wanted
go
to
ahead.
add something to that. So there is again a parallel in history that people know very well. It's called the killing of the innocents. So, in order to kill the baby Jesus, the king at that time, Herod, he resorted to the mass killing of the children of a certain area around Bethlehem. To be sure, just killed all the children to be sure that the Messiah would not be born there. So we could say that perhaps the Western people are singled out because um, the globalists, which of course are antithetical to any kind of human progress and human life, the globalists suspect that the key to liberating the earth from their rule is present within the European peoples. But that's just a side thought.
Perhaps a Gen Xer. This next point is one of the most interesting points that you make in the book, from my perspective. It has to do with the book Moby Dick by Herman Melville, often considered by scholars to be the greatest work of fiction or the greatest novel produced by an American writer. And so on page 144, you state, Long ago, a great American writer wrote a book about the diabolic possession that men can fall prey to if they ignore God sent warnings and if they transgress God given boundaries. In that book, Moby Dick, in the final analysis, the hunt for the white whale was revealed to be no mere undertaking for profit, glory, or adventure. It was a deliberate war on creation, and beyond that, a war on the Creator himself, a deliberate quest to reach absolute evil. The crew followed the captain to the end, and to their end, by their own free will. The Creator allows for such free will, but he determines its final physical boundary as well. He lets man choose, even to choose predestination away from him and against him. So, my response to this particular passage is that it's interesting to me that what many consider to be the greatest American novel may also best represent the destiny of America. Captain Ahab is fighting with God through his struggle with the white whale, Moby Dick. So, would you say, Alexander, that, for example, the transgender project that is pushed on all of us daily, minute to minute, that we see today, is really a struggle with the order of the universe by means of attacking one of the core truths of nature, the duality of the sexes?
And certainly, that's an aspect of it. Of course, the quotation that you take from my book, it's positioned to describe the hunt of the West for the white whale in the geopolitical sense, because there's also such a thing, right? There is a geopolitical crusade going on, crusade to kill any kind of antibody still present in the modern world, antibody to, let's say, the globalist organism, the satano-globalist organism. And Moby Dick is, of course, a very good expression of this. Um, I think the problem here is that you can interpret this novel on many levels. And the crusade aspect, I think, is the most important one because a certain amount of admiration or of just appreciation for the stamina of the crew of the Pequod cannot be denied. So there is a real spirit here driving forward these people, although it's bringing them to the abyss. In any case, I think America, of course, is the most progressed sense of the world, West, yes, the most progressed part of it. So if the West is the most progressed part of humanity, then America is the most progressed part of the West. And this leads me to believe that many signs of what will happen in the future probably can be understood by just understanding the trajectory on which American culture is and American geopolitics are. I think in this sense, it's a diagnostic tool. And I've tried to use it as such in the book as well.
Yeah, after reading this part of your book, it sent me on a journey to watch various versions of the novel. I read the novel many years ago, but then I looked up the various versions that they've made into movies, just to look at different approaches to interpreting. There are widely different interpretations, really, of the novel, which allows for that because it's rather poetic, in my opinion, sort of esoteric, I think. Um, Now, the concept that I mentioned earlier that we would get to eventually, one of the basic concepts in your book, the globalist cabal. So on pages 160 to 161, Alexander, you state, the globalist cabal acts, thinks, and feels in direct defiance of history and geography, and of reality itself. It insists upon altering reality, completely and forever. It seeks to rule the world and reshape it, erasing history, overcoming geography, and destroying reality. The more intelligent of the globalist cabal's puppets and mouthpieces, the Blinkens, the Newlands, the Sunaks, the Macrons, are not blind ignoramuses. They just deliberately chose to ignore history, geography, and reality. They are driven by a greater vision that is stamped upon them and maintained in the very peculiar cultic bubble void in which they live. And you place live in quotes. I like that. Essentially, you continue, it is an anti-human, transhuman, and post-human vision. A vision that undoubtedly anticipates and prepares the as yet unrealized vision of the Antichrist, who long ago deliberately set himself up against the reality of creation. Thus, the tools and mechanisms of the globalist cabal's arsenals are deliberately applied against history, geography, and reality. The entire package, military aggression, from humanitarian intervention to regime change, economic warfare, from sanction regime to market reform, bio-Leninist subversion, from women's suffrage to critical race theory, psychosocial deconstruction, from MK Ultra experiments to transgender legislation, biotechnical control, from a morning after pill to vaccination mandate, has only one direction and one exit. Close quote. So, Alexander, what is this one direction and exit of all these actions and devices of the globalist cabal that have been enacted over several decades or even centuries?
Well, on word transhumanism, it is the supersession of the human race, the ending of the rule of humanity over the earth, and its supersession with another, we call it between quotes, life form, but which is in fact a perversion and an inversion of the human creation. And this has, of course, many, many aspects, but one important one would be to go a little bit further in what you said. I put the word life between brackets for a reason, because, of course, we are talking about an anti life cult, an anti life existence that they are aiming at. And the anti life form that you could imagine, for example, lives in science fiction. Western science fiction is a brain being uploaded to a computer, or the human being merged with machinery to the point that he can live forever, right? Because, of course, living forever is one of the things that humans cannot do and that they regret not being able to do. So, living forever is one of the aims. And this brings us back all the way to the beginning of humanity. Um, Human were originally, it said, created immortal. Then they fell and they lost their mortality. They lost their immortality. And of course, this was activated via a lie. So Satan, when he seduced the female, it should be said, he said, uh, "You shall surely not die." But of course, that's the opposite of what happened. And I think here this example is not so inappropriate because our elite is this globalist cabal. In a certain sense, they are as much victims of this lie as anybody else because they truly believe the idea that transhumanism will somehow lift them to a state better than that which they know in their human form. Of course, that makes them monsters. It creates monsters out of themselves and out of the people that fall victim to them. But that does not mean that they are not being fooled. The real agenda is, in my view, not human. So the agenda underpinning transhumanism and the power underpinning satano-globalism is not a human force. And of course, that's very difficult to accept for people that are not brought up in a religious have not been brought up in a religious tradition, an authentic religious tradition. And it's also very difficult to understand for people that are brought up in the modern scientist paradigm, because the scientism is supposed to progress and eventually make possible immortality. So it's very difficult to understand, but for somebody coming from a traditionalist point of view, it's not. It's crystal clear that a non-human power is informing the Satano-globalist agenda.
Yeah, it makes me think of the great novel by C.S. Lewis, That Hideous Strength, which is rather underrepresented when people refer to great works, dystopian works, or works of future totalitarian governments. 1984 and Brave New World are always referred to, but I don't often hear C.S. Lewis's work, That Hideous Strength. And in that strength, Lewis imagined the cabal that has taken over this small university town wants to eventually eradicate all life on Earth, not just human, but everything. Just imagine a giant parking lot paving the entire surface of the Earth, plants, animals, insects, everything, along with humans.
Yes.
And so this is something that C.S. Lewis wrote, 70 or 80 years ago. It was before 1984 was published by Orwell. So he was really more farsighted than a lot of others, and I see echoes of this in your statements throughout the book, but especially right here.
Well, yes, I think that Western literary tradition is full of people that, in fact, intrinsically adhere to the traditionalist point of view, which is natural because the traditionalist point of view is that of all authentic cultures. And anybody that represents that culture in an authentic way would automatically recognize the fact that human life on this planet is subject to forces greater than human life, right? There are forces far greater than us steering the universe, even on the physical level. So this recognition is something that is imparted by any authentic religious tradition, and it's just a loss of religious tradition which makes people see this as a surprise. So, for example, Tolkien or Lewis, as you quoted, they are seen as great masters of literature, which they are, but it's not understood that they merely represent a very simple traditionalist thesis, we might call, or worldview point.
Right. All right. Um, so now to the theme of the globalist destruction of nation states, which you return to throughout the book. And specifically, you give this example of the destruction of the nation of Yugoslavia around the turn of the third millennium, around 2000 or so, as a blueprint for the conquest of other nations. And you quote from Michel Chodorkovsky's 2021 book, The U.S. NATO War of Aggression Against Yugoslavia. You give a review of this book in your book. And so on pages 164 to 165, you state, quote, history is written by the victors. Administered in several doses since the 1980s, NATO-backed neoliberal medicine has helped to destroy Yugoslavia. Yet the global media and academia have carefully overlooked or denied its central role. Instead, they sing the praises of the free market. The social and political impact of economic restructuring in Yugoslavia has been carefully erased from our collective understanding. Opinion makers instead dogmatically present cultural, ethnic, and religious divisions as the sole cause of war and devastation. Such false consciousness not only masks the truth, it also prevents us from acknowledging precise historical occurrences. Ultimately, it distorts the true sources of social conflict. When applied to the former Yugoslavia, it obscures the historical foundations of South Slavic unity, solidarity, and identity, what constituted a multi-ethnic society. The eventual reconstruction, in quotes, of Yugoslavia, formulated in the context of the free market, also in quotes, reforms and financed by international debt, largely purport to create a safe haven for foreign investors, rather than to rehabilitate the country's economic and social infrastructure. The national economy will be dismantled, Western banks will take over financial institutions, local industrial enterprises which have not been totally destroyed will be driven into bankruptcy. The most profitable state assets will be transferred into the hands of foreign capital under the World Bank sponsored privatization program. In turn, this strong economic medicine, imposed by external creditors, will contribute to further boosting a criminal economy, which feeds on poverty and dislocation. Close quotes. And you say a bit later on page 179 on the West's current multidimensional Ukraine campaign against Russia that the same thing is now happening in Ukraine that happened in Yugoslavia decades ago. And on pages 182 to 183, you say, for example, all the tools and techniques supplied in the ex-Yugoslav space of the 90s are applied to the ex-Soviet space of the 2020s. of course with slightly updated technology and on a hugely amplified scale. The same proxy strategy, now with Ukrainian instead of the Kosovar freedom fighter, cannon fodder, and Azov instead of Mujahideen, foreign volunteers, close quote. So based upon this long passage and these other two shorter passages, I want to ask this: is this the very same blueprint that is now being used against the United States? For it seems to me, it's just one example, as if racism was hardly an issue in the 1980s and 1990s when I was growing up, but someone made it an issue somewhere between 2010 and 2015. What would you like to say about that?
Well, just for the readers and the listeners' benefit, um, you're quoting from the second part of the book, which is dedicated to understanding the resistance forces, those forces in the world standing up to Satano-globalism. And of course, I'm using here Yugoslavia as a model to understand larger processes. So you're correcting, pointing to the possible relevance of what was tried there to what is tried now within the West. I think there is a certain amount of interchangeability in strategy, tactics, and methods um, for forcing ethnicities, nations, nation states into submission. And certainly, Yugoslavia is a very useful model. That's why I've used that review in my book. It is to point out to people on a very small scale what happened in Yugoslavia can, of course, be applied almost anywhere. Any nation state can be destroyed in the same way, using the same forces, although with some technical improvements and some updates as far as psyops, perhaps. And I think the fine tuning that has taken place since Yugoslavia, because that was still in the pre-internet age, has of course made these processes quicker, has made these processes stronger, and has made these processes used by the Satano globalists more effective. But that doesn't mean that the essential ingredients are not present. So it is to use historical divisions, religious divisions, to create them out of the blue wherever necessary. For example, one example that you could easily see now is the creation of Ukraine. The nation of Ukraine was created in order to function as battering ram into the greater Russian sphere. So, of course, it is possible that a similar model would be used within the West. It was tried in my country already in the 19th century. Of course, the British and the French found it very useful to create a country called Belgium because they wanted to weak Netherlands. They created a new country. They carved it out of the territory of the Netherlands. So the process is, of course, something that is now very sophisticated because it works on not so much on a military scale and not so much on a direct kinetic scale, although those elements still exist, but rather on a domestic subversion scale, multidimensional warfare being applied to subversive processes aimed at the civilian population. So I think these are the most powerful tools imaginable because, in fact, you can subvert your enemy without having to put your army in the field. It doesn't always work, but in many instances it has worked. In Yugoslavia as well. So, for example, the state called Slovenia now split off from Yugoslavia almost without a fight. It was just a few weeks of marginal fighting. And I think it's very possible that similar processes will be used to subvert whatever nations, nation states in the West stand up to the Setano globalist order. That can happen. There can be a local uprising, and then such mechanisms will certainly be tried. I mean, we can see an example in Spain. There was an attempt at a Catalan separatist movement. It didn't work out. Perhaps Spain was not such a threat to the globalist elite, but we can see it also in the UK, Scotland being adverted, being prepared for independence, and so on. I would say that even within the United States, that's possible. Definitely, the possibility lives in the American consciousness because America had a war of secession, of course, in the 1860s, but you can also see it reflected in modern Hollywood productions. So I remember a movie called Civil War, I think it was called, produced a few years ago, showing the possible secession for whatever reason of Florida and California, and these states being set up to fight the central government. I think these processes are purposefully applied anywhere that the globalist, sustainable globalist elite thinks is necessary. And they are doing so ruthlessly all around the world. And it would not surprise me it would be used in an equally violent version within Western countries whenever they deem it necessary.
Just to give a more concrete spin on this, or a more direct question on this matter, would you say that things like BLM, Black Lives Matter, and all of the commercials that you constantly see with sort of mixed racial cultures or transgender characters, is this just another example of a means of sort of a color revolution or a takedown of a nation in the United States of the same kind, using slightly different means that happened in Yugoslavia, and then it's happening in Ukraine? So are they all of one piece?
Identity subversion, of course, that's the key. So now the dominant group within the United States, sociologically speaking, in traditional sociological literature, is called the WASP group, White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. So that's the nation-carrying group according to sociological theory. So it stands to reason that that group should be undermined. Now, what is the easiest way to undermine the WASP, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestant? It's very simple. You make him unwhite. And we know that according to the one drop rule, a person becomes non-white the moment he has only one non-white ancestor. And the visibility of this mixing process is so obvious that it allows for easy identification. So this would be the easiest mechanism to undermine, let's say, the founding stock of the United States nation state, because the United States, of course, is also a nation state. And I think this is a very it's a very deliberate attempt. These propaganda examples that you mentioned, a very deliberate attempt to make the people commit suicide, to make this ruling group commit suicide. In fact, because the moment that they voluntarily mix, um, nobody can say that violence was done to them. They voluntarily chose not to be white. What is easier than that? I think it would be one of the best examples of cognitive warfare and its success. And I think this success is also, of course, being shown in Europe itself. I would answer it that way.
Okay, thank you. On page 210 of your book, you refer to an interesting tactic or theme used by the globalists, and this is the idea of sacrificial violence. And this is within your review of a different book, Yusuf Hindi's book, La guerre des États-Unis contre l'Europe et l'avenir de l'État. And on page 210, you state, in this context, since the disappearance of the state of law and justice with it, sacrificial violence has resurfaced. There is a link between the collapse of traditional religion, the abolition of the state of law, and the resurgence of the sacrifice of innocence. A mass sacrifice enacted through the political power that has rendered semi-obligatory injections by the million with an experimental product that has turned out to be dangerous, close quote. And obviously you're referring there to the COVID vaccines. But just this general idea of sacrificial violence, can we look to the globalists to use other forms of sacrificial violence, or are there already examples existing now that you can point to? Can you explain this mechanism a little bit?
There are many forms of sacrifice. Life in real tradition is sacrosanct. So life forms need to be protected. That is why authentic traditions frown upon practices such as euthanasia and abortion. And any kind of life undermining procedure, and for that matter, and sacrifice in authentic traditions has been or projected on non-human life forms, or sublimated into sacraments, so as it has been done in Christianity. So, ideally speaking, within the West, within the Christian West, there is no sacrifice possible because the ultimate sacrifice was made by Jesus. There's just a commemoration of such in the form of wine and bread. Now, the return of real sacrifice, blood sacrifice in the West is, of course, very, very significant. And we can see it by um, an almost ritualistic adherence to sacrifice beliefs. So, the right to abortion, the right to euthanasia, it's not just mere the practice, it's the right to, which is a sacrament in a certain way, an opposite sacrament. So the biggest culling mechanism of the Western peoples has been abortion. It's very simple. Of course, there are plenty of others, but you pointed out to the vaccination campaign. A part of the sacrifice to be effective, it needs to be, that sounds very strange, it needs to be voluntary. So, a real sacrifice, for a sacrifice to be valid, human sacrifice to be valid, it has to be willed. Jesus went willing to his death, right? So it's quite amazing. And Isaac also submitted to his father's knife voluntarily. So he was saved, but in any case, um, I think this aspect should not be underestimated. The voluntary aspect is very, very important. So if people want to make a blood sacrifice, they first have to accept it in their mind and in their heart. So abortion and euthanasia are rights and values. This is the first thing to understand about this. The same thing happened with the vaccinations. The vaccinations were voluntary. Whatever pressure was brought to bear, nobody was chasing people with injection needles. They were accepted, and you even had to sign for them if you wanted to have them in many countries. So I think the voluntary aspect here is important. Similarly, there are blood sacrifices being made um, violently, uh, but still voluntarily, for example, in war. The Ukrainian people are fighting voluntarily their war against Russia, against their own Slavic blood brothers. And this is very important. I think we should never forget that mind manipulation is essential for the understanding of sacrificial practices. Of course, MK Ultra has already shown the direction into which mind manipulation can work. But I think much more sophisticated techniques are at work right now in the collective sphere. I think the voluntary aspect here is very, very important to understand the ritual effectiveness.
Okay, I would like to say two things just in response to that. First, one could argue that although there is a level of voluntary action in the COVID response, that there was compulsion. There were threats constantly, losing jobs, losing social connections, and so that was voluntary under a great amount of pressure. So I would say that's a bit debatable on that point. So are you arguing also that there is a need for blood sacrifice in human psychology? That if we don't employ the older forms and traditions, that we must create something new, whether people realize what they're doing or not, that this is sort of a need in human nature for some variety of blood sacrifice?
Um, the blood cycle is definitely important in what I would call heresy. So Christian heresies have emphasized all kinds of antinomian behaviors. So for heresies to be effective, they have to also have a ritual component. Now, sacrifice has been reintroduced in many heresies. And one of the greatest examples that we are facing right now is the insistence among many so called Christians and so called Jews that a third temple has to be rebuilt, exactly for the purpose of reinstating the blood sacrifice. Now, you're asking about whether this is a universal necessity. From a traditionalist point of view, it's not. From a traditionalist point of view, um, rituals they are gradual, and there are many kinds of, let's say, hypostasis of sacrifice. So a sacrifice can be effective if it is done according to the right intention and done according to the right form. So in Hinduism, for example, there exists a blood sacrifice, but it's been replaced in most cases with a sacrifice towards flowers, for example, or food. And of course, the highest hypostasis of the sacrifice, it is the abstract one. So the one in which the human does not need uh, a physical element in order to change his state, because of course a ritual aims at the change of state. And this has been achieved by the Christian Church. The mere intention suffices, for example, to be baptized. Also, it suffices as far as participation in the Eucharist in certain circumstances. And I think there are, of course, in other religions, there are many parallels. I'm just mentioning the most obvious ones. I don't think that um, any kind of traditional religion needs a blood sacrifice. To the extent that they are part of it, I would say they are leftovers or, let's say, compromises made for quite primitive stratum of the population. That is, a stratum of the population that has not yet grown to the truly human level. That still needs to sees itself as being of having to make sacrifices on the mere human material level. That's how I would answer that.
So your last point, yes, thank you. Your last point anticipates another question I was going to ask on that matter, and that is, even if most humans do not require blood sacrifice and it's not a universal human trait or need, are there powerful groups still extant today that do believe it is necessary blood sacrifice and that it is a necessary trait of human psychology?
I think, of course, that's certainly, but I think there are very specific purposes attached to these groups. So groups that insist upon such sacrifices, whether secret or not, they pursue specific purposes. I would say they pursue in the West, because there are such groups, they pursue, um, let's say, devolutionary strategy. So they want to undo, literally, that what Christianity has made possible, and they want to undo progress, also spiritual progress made on a collective form. I think such a thing it does exist, and the most effective way to do that is simply refer back to the easiest way, namely blood sacrifice. Blood sacrifice, uh, in the sense that perhaps this cannot be shown yet in public as a sacrifice as such, but it can definitely be shown. Um, People can be conditioned to accept it slowly by slowly. I think that's what's being done in the West. So there's kind of a desensitization process going on. For example, the gradual introduction of abortion rights, the gradual introduction of euthanasia rights, but they're hidden in hospitals, in maternity wards, hidden away from the public eye. I think similarly, sacrifice of blood on a larger scale in war has also been somewhat obscured because it takes place in faraway countries, although coming closer. But I think there will be a point that it will be unveiled, also in the West, in a very literal sense, because the ultimate aim would be idol worship, right? Idol worship um, with the blood sacrifice, was also in the ancient Israel the ultimate heresy. So the ultimate heresy was to make a sacrifice of your own child, as the Phoenicians are rumored to have done to Baal, Moloch, and so on. And I think this is resurfacing in the West. This principle is resurfacing. Child sacrifice through abortion, child sacrifice in a hidden way, but of course, morphing into more open forms. And I think we are on the cusp of revelation in this sense. I think our globalist elite will at some point switch to an open sacrificial regime.
Mhm. Yeah, you mentioned a moment ago the sacrifice of, or the almost sacrifice of Isaac by Abraham, and comparing that to the sacrifice of Jesus Christ. And I would take exception to that because one major difference is the sacrifice occurred in the case of Jesus, but it did not occur in the case of Isaac. And the other difference is that Isaac was a child and Jesus was an adult. And I would question whether, if God had made Abraham go through with it, would he have allowed Isaac to choose otherwise? I would take exception to whether Isaac actually made a choice there, or an act of free will occurred in that instance.
This is a very interesting question. Of course, in the Bible, Isaac is an antitype, right? So how theologians they see it as an antitype, uh, prefiguring of the sacrifice of Jesus. Also, you point rightly out that it took place in the young years of Isaac. I would answer it in this way regarding the globalist elite. They see the Western people uh, as sheeple. Yes, so as unworthy of higher considerations. People that are childlike in a certain way, that can be fooled, that can be deceived where necessary, and that can also be led to the slaughter when necessary. I think um, it is a very good question. Is a child able to make a conscious choice for sacrifice? This is a very hard question to answer. That depends also on the culture, because in certain cultures, it's supposed that a man is fully a man on reaching puberty. For example, he's 13 years old. In other cultures, it's a little bit later. But it's an interesting question, nonetheless, which you raise. And of course, the infantilization of the Western masses um, it's quite astounding, and you are correct to point out that the sacrifice that's made by such infantilized masses may not be intentional enough to serve the purpose. Whether the globalist elite is able to understand that or able to manipulate that further is a very interesting question.
And the example of Abraham and Isaac, I would also say, is an example of great deception and duplicity, because Isaac is only informed as to what his role is at the very last second. And I believe they take a 3-day journey to the spot where the sacrifice is to occur. And there's no indication in the Old Testament that he has told Isaac beforehand or during the journey what's going to happen to him. So I don't know. It's not a very good moral exemplar story there. It's just about blind obedience of killing someone that you love dearly. And I mean, I would argue that this is an attack on tradition, actually, in an ostensibly traditional text. Um, Killing loved ones for some abstract greater goal, which we've often seen in the 20th century from communist social times. There's some idea out there that's so great that you should kill anyone you love, no matter what. Very similar idea to what we have with Isaac and Abraham, I think.
Yes, I think you might very well be right in seeing it as an anti-traditionalist aspect of Holy Scripture, an element that includes authentic traditionalist religion, but it is nevertheless relevant to the present situation, because it's very well possible that those who rule us or seek to rule us, I would call them the satanic globalist elite, that they are modeling themselves more on the Isaac sacrifice than anything else. Um, Inversion, perversion, and reversion and devolution are definitely common goals and common aspects of all their program points, I would say.
All right. Let's move to another point I have here, and this is also related to Yusuf Hindi's book that you review. On pages 219 to 220, you state, concluding this review of Yusuf Hindi's La guerre des États-Unis contre l'Europe et l'avenir de l'État, it is necessary to remind the reader that the author has non European roots, but that in writing this highly timely work, he has done far more for Europe than most Europeans have done at this hour. The reviewer, therefore, has a recommendation of his own to add to Hindi's highly valuable prescriptions. It is this: that the enslaved peoples of Europe should from now on refuse their American fast food rations, shed their American jean rags, break their chains of American sensual bondage, and wake up from their American virtual reality spell. That they should recapture their ancestors' spirit and pull their ancestors' sword out of the stone of history. Close quote. Can you elaborate, Alexander, a bit on this assumedly Arthurian sword in the stone imagery? What do you mean here exactly? Why did you choose that image?
Well, identity deformation once again. So the American influences that I note, of course, they reflect a certain kind of American influences, going from dress code to behavioral codes to consumerist codes. These are all prime examples of mechanisms that lead to identity deformation in the case of the European peoples in their ancestral homeland. So the only way to effectively counteract identity deformation is to rediscover who you really are, to rediscover the root of your identity. I would argue that each of the European nations has an archetypal identity. Now, everybody that is part of a European nation can himself understand these things very well, but it's difficult to express, and there is no one European identity. There are multiple ones, although they share certain characteristics. And I think the image of pulling the sword out of the stone exactly means that it's an act of will. So to relive your identity, to rediscover your identity is not an intellectual process. It's not an emotional process. It's primarily a kinetic uh, process, which has a symbolic aspect, and it's an act of will. You want to be a people, or you don't want to be a people. And I think this act is symbolized in the European tradition most effectively through the sword. Because, of course, to define yourself in a continent where there are many different nations living and which has been invaded by people for in historical times, many times, that means you have to use the sword. It's not just not enough to just experience it. You need to have a kinetic aspect to the rediscovery of your identity. The act of will is what is required here. That's what I try to express.
Yeah, I would agree with that. So that makes me think about the Arthur legend in a little bit more depth here. The others who attempted to pull the sword from the stone in the legend and were unsuccessful, whereas Arthur was successful in retrieving the stone, were the others unsuccessful because they really knew deep down that they were not the leader? They didn't have the capacity to lead.
Yeah, they're not worthy. Only the one that's worthy can pull the sword out of the stone. This means there is a secret here involved. There is a vocational aspect to it. Only one person can be king, and the king, of course, represents an archetype. He represents a one and forever king. And to incarnate this principle is something that a person can only become aware of gradually, probably, maybe even slowly. And I think the power that is attached to it is not human. So, this, in the same way that the Satano-globalist elite is in fact deriving its strength from a non-human power source, uh, Satan, let's say it very shortly. So also people that stand up to it and stand up for the true identity of their nation would be inspired by a higher force, a non-human force. In this case, we can call it God. So this means that this person has to incarnate a divine principle and act on this for his people. And he has to incarnate literally at the same time as the divine principle his nation. So it's actually an impersonal calling. It's no surprise that very few people are worthy of this very great vocation. Whether there are any such people alive now that could be king is very debatable, but that this doesn't mean it's not possible. Arthur, as the legend goes, also was a nobody. That's how I would answer.
Thank you. There's one more subject I would like to discuss today, and then perhaps we can do a second part to this interview because there are several other questions that I think are important and a large portion of your book that we could cover. But the last subject that I would like to discuss today is the idea of Eurasianism, because I believe that many Americans have no idea what this means. Starting around page 231 of your book, you begin to discuss the idea of Eurasianism in the context of your review of another book, Leonid Savin's 2020 book, Ordo Pluriversalis, The End of Pax America and the Rise of Multipolarity. So can you please, Alexander, elaborate a bit on the concept of Eurasianism for American listeners? Because this term, in my experience, is virtually not ever mentioned in the American media. I've never heard it mentioned on CNN, MSNBC, Fox, OAN, or Newsmax, for example.
Yes. So again, to clarify for the audience, there are many topics we are talking about here, but in the book they are quite structured. People can choose, pick and choose, in fact. Eurasianism comes up, to give it some context, in my discussion of the forces standing up in a geopolitical playing field towards globalism. Intellectually, philosophically, a very important PowerPoint of resistance is the Eurasianist movement, which I am part of. It's, of course, most famously represented by Professor Alexander Dugin from Moscow. But there are many others, and it's a very illustrious movement to which many great thinkers have belonged, going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And this movement calls itself Eurasianist, or Eurasian oriented. Now, of course, people in the West haven't heard of it because it's a very obscure movement. It is so more of a think tank than a school. And its aspects are so multifaceted because there are geopoliticians, there are philosophers, there are artists even, there are historians and other scientists involved in it, including cosmologists. So it's a think tank in the best sense of the word, I would say. And Eurasianism has a traditionalist basis. So the basis of Eurasianism is traditionalism. You could actually say that Eurasianism is traditionalism applied to geopolitical thinking and political philosophy. That's probably a good, accurate description of what is Eurasianism. Eurasianism, the term, of course, comes from the great continent, which is straddled by Russia, which, of course, sees itself as the third Rome, which also is the heartland. So in geopolitical theory, the heart of the world, it is the center of the earth, is located in the Eurasian landmass, the point furthest from the sea, the highest point. All these points are located on the Eurasian landmass. And the other continents, the world island being Eurasia plus Africa, the other continents are just merely islands seen from this perspective. That means the heartland represents something for Eurasianists, does not only represent a geopolitical principle, it also represents an entity in, I would call, sacred geography. There used to be such a thing as sacred geography. My second book by Cambridge scholars is dedicated to that. Sacred geography is probably very misunderstood for people, but it means that the earth itself, being God's creation, has certain sacred features, hidden points, power points, People, of course, are familiar with the obvious pilgrimage sites such as Mecca and so on, and Rome being one of the power points as well, being replaced later on by Istanbul, Constantinople, and then by Moscow. So there is a, let's say, spiritual aspect um, to the concepts that are being formulated by Eurasianism. This is probably the most interesting part of it. It's synthesizing sacred geography with geopolitics. And this makes it, in my view, highly powerful because it taps into archetypes and it taps into true rooted identities and it respects traditions. So this makes it a very, very powerful voice, which also explains why in the West nobody's talking about it, because it's an antidote um, of a power that nothing, no political philosophy in the West could stand up to. That's how I would typify it.
Yeah, I would say that the first 2 years of coverage of the Ukraine-Russia war was almost daily coverage and sometimes wall-to-wall coverage in the American media, and yet this concept, this idea, was never mentioned. In my experience, of course, I didn't watch it all, but I mean that seems to be a great indicator of propaganda when one of the central motivating ideas of the, let's say, the team that is opposed by the power structure is not even mentioned. This cannot be a completely honest description of events of what is occurring in the area. Well, I have one more comment on Eurasianism specifically, and then I think we will draw this particular session to a close. On page 232, you state, quote, Eurasianist thinkers and publicists are committed to the ruthless exposure of the inauthentic identities and illusory doctrines promoted by the globalist tyranny that rules the West. The totalitarian liberalism that seeks to rule the world, and the cultural nihilist worldview that underpins both. Thus, Eurasianism is committed to an uncompromising crusade against Western-based globalist tyranny, which is most visibly represented in that synchronized high finance, big tech, big pharma, and the mainstream media. Before Eurasianist politics can destroy the institutional infrastructure of nihilist globalism, however, Eurasianist metapolitics must first destroy its ideological superstructure. It must first deconstruct the globalist nihilist frame that has captured the minds and hearts of ordinary people around the world, and the mass of the Western people among them. Inner spiritual liberation is a precondition for outer material liberation. Close quote. So, Alexander, how will Eurasianists do this? How will they deconstruct the globalist nihilist frame, as you call it, that has captured ordinary people's hearts and minds?
Well, this is a quite a wrong question because, of course, the nation that should represent Eurasianism in real world politics and in the media sphere would be Russia. There's no country that has less soft power and more clumsy soft power approach, propaganda approach than Russia. So, in that sense, Eurasianism is handicapped because its power center is located there, and its power center is unable to represent the true thinking and the true inspiration of the anti globalist crusade that many countries have embarked on, and which all are knotted together in Eurasianism. Now, I think the most important part of a struggle is, of course, that's logical because I'm coming from academic circles and scientific background. For me, the most important struggle is the struggle by the mind. I'm talking about the public domain, not the personal domain. It's a struggle of the mind. Um, so it's being said that all battles are won in the temples before they are won in on the battlefield. And the temple is also, of course, the temple is the place where people clear their minds and reset themselves and make themselves able to think and act correctly. So, in this sense, the temple is the preparation. And I think that Eurasianism is doing its job, nevertheless, no matter the handicaps by um, which it suffers from. And I think, in fact, the Satanic globalist elite is doing Eurasianism a favor because it is currently embarked upon so many different deconstructive projects within the West and outside the West that it's utterly discrediting itself. So, in a certain sense, Eurasianism, as far as political philosophy is concerned, especially for the Western people, will probably be simply the last one standing. It will simply be the default position to which any kind of thinking person will have to revert if he engages in political philosophy and in geopolitical thinking after all these programs have run their course. It is simply the only viable option for the European peoples remaining on the table. That doesn't mean it will, Eurasianism in its present form will provide, let's say, the Weltanschauung, the worldview that's necessary for such a reinvented new Europe at the other side of this tunnel. But it certainly provides the grounding. It has done the groundwork. It has done a lot of clearing activity. So a lot of false philosophies, false ideas have been dispelled by Eurasianist thinkers. And there will simply come a point that, let's say, the empire of lies will collapse under its own weight. And then what is left standing will be Eurasianism. That's how I see Eurasianism in its current trajectory. That does not mean that it's not possible that, of course, somebody would come along and represents this principle in ways that are unanticipated at the moment. So Eurasianism has reinvented itself multiple times, including during the predicament of the Russians during this Soviet rule, during the Cold War, and afterwards. And I think that will probably inevitably happen. Eurasianism will also reshape itself, reform itself, adjust itself, grow. I think this is already happening. A selection process has already taken place. A lot of chaff has been divided from the grains, and it's very well possible that at some point new views, new people will make Eurasianism available to Western people in a very attractive and a very accessible manner. That's what I foresee because I do believe that the saturation point for the globalist narratives has already long time been reached in the West. I don't think there's any serious person who still believes mainstream academic and media narratives. That's how I would answer that.
Thank you. Yeah, it's sort of the idea that the mountain will be there regardless of whether the clouds are obscuring it or not, and it's not a matter of the mountain moving the clouds out of the way. It's just eventually the clouds will dissipate or
Yes.
move on, and then the mountain will be self-evident once again. Well, I want to thank Dr. Alexander Wolfheze, my guest today, for a very profitable session. I think my fellow traditionalist and fellow Polaris podcast creator. And I hope that we can do another section on this, or a segment rather, on this topic of his book, Globus Horribilis. And I enjoyed reading the book, and it offers a lot, and there are many topics covered, and many great authors referred to at length. And I want to thank you again, Alexander.
Thank you very much for putting the time in it. And you'll, of course, force me into a second session, but I'll be pleased to do that because it's good to talk to a fellow traditionalist, as you say. And I do hope that people will read the book, not so much because they have to read my book, but because inside that book are a lot of eternal wisdoms being presented to people, not only from Holy Scripture and not only from philosophers, but also from contemporary thinkers who are relevant to many problems that are taking place on the globe this time. In fact, my book has been simply doing its traditionalist job, namely carrying traditionalist thought into the modern age. And I hope that people will read it for that reason only. Thank you.